So we're starting our series, or we are continuing our series of the women in the Bible. And we will be going on to, we'll be looking at Tamar. Now, Tamar is not one that is known by a lot of folks, but it is a very important figure, especially in our Christian tradition, our Judeo-Christian tradition. And the reason why that is so is because, my mouse, is because if we look at, there it is, the genealogy of Jesus, she is listed in the genealogy. So just kind of looking at it, fairly briefly, this is the genealogy as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1. If you open up the Bible to the New Testament, it is the very first thing that you read. So these are the genealogy of Jesus: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, right? Hezron, Aram, Abinadab, Nashon, Salmon, Boaz by Ruth. We'll be looking at Ruth next week. Obed, Jesse to King David. Okay, that's the first part of the genealogy. And then, of course, it continues on. David, Solomon by the wife of Uriah, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asaph, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amos, Josiah, Jeconiah, and then from Jeconiah to Salathiel, Zerubbabel, Abidiud, and then from here on, the names get really weird, blah, 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 blah. Mathan, Jacob, all the way to Mary, Joseph, husband of Mary, and Jesus. So you can look at the genealogy of Jesus. Typically in the ancient Jewish tradition, or even now, much of the ancient traditions were heavily patriarchal, right? Much of the story, biblical story, is written from the perspective of men, and the society itself is heavily male-oriented. In fact, yesterday, as we were we started the new series on the wisdom literatures on our Tuesday evening classes. We recognize that a lot of the majority of the writing of the Bible, and especially the wisdom literature, is written from the perspective of men. And sometimes we kind of take that for granted and realize, yeah, it's always written for men. There is one book in the Bible, the whole Bible, there's one book that is actually written from the perspective of a woman. And it's not Esther, it's not Ruth. Those stories are still written from the perspective of a man telling the story of a heroine. However, there is one book that is written from the perspective of a woman, and that is the Song of Solomon, right, or the Song of Songs. It's a love story or a love poem. But anyhow, the fact that there are 5 women listed in the genealogy of Jesus, and again, this is told from in the Gospel of Matthew, and so each of the 4 Gospels have a different take of what happened, the story of Jesus, and they have a different audience. They each have a purpose for their gospel message, and the Gospel of Matthew is written for the Jewish community. And so knowing that it's written to the Jewish community, whereas like the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark that were written to the Gentile community or a much more larger community, the Gospel of Matthew was primarily written for the Jewish community. And so the genealogy being in the Gospel of Matthew, and that in this genealogy, where it's all men interlaced in there, to have these 5 women is pretty significant. Now, who are these 5 women? We see Tamar, we see Ruth, we see, well, it doesn't give the wife of Solomon by name, the wife of Uriah by Solomon. That's Bathsheba. We had someone else in here. Blah, 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 blah. What am I missing? We had Tamar, Ruth. We're missing one. Rahab is supposed to be here somewhere. And then we have Mary. Anyhow, so there are these 5 women that are supposed to be in the genealogy of Jesus. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. And the interesting thing about these 5 women, though, is they actually have a particular, particular importance of these 5 women, is that these women were not of nobility. Tamar, and we're going to look at the story of Tamar more closely today, is one that, as we get into the story, is one who commits incest. Rahab was a prostitute, and Tamar also a prostitute. Ruth was actually a foreigner. Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, which of course King David takes advantage of, and therefore is mixed into the story of adultery. And of course you have Mary, who, yes, very innocent girl, but she was one who was a pregnant. So someone once said a pregnant teenage girl, right? So it's interesting that you have these stories of these, or naming of these 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus, and yet they're not like King David or Solomon. They're actually ones who were victims of a society, and yet their names get added in here, right? And it also kind of shows that the fact that you have these stories of these even Matthew doesn't paint the genealogy of Jesus as being this perfect family. As we read the stories, what I love about reading the stories in the Old Testament is that when you really dig into the stories, they're just as messed up as us today, right? every family, every character in the Bible have problems, has issues, which in a way is the message of the gospel, or the message of our faith. We need help. That's why we need God, So it has that sense to it. All right. So then, okay, we get into the story of Tamar. Now, who was Tamar? Tamar was the daughter of Judah. Now, who is
daughter-in-law, it says.
Oh, was that Joy?
It says daughter-in-law.
Oh, sorry. Yes, daughter-in-law of
Okay.
Judah. That is exactly correct. So first of all, let's get to who was Judah. Judah was the 4th son of Jacob. So if you remember the genealogy starting from Abraham, right? Abraham was the one that was called, and we looked at Sarah last week, that was called by God to go to the promised land and would have children as numerous as the sand in the sea and the stars in the sky. Jacob, we know, had Ishmael and Isaac, and of course through Isaac, Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and then through Jacob had 12 sons. And of the 12 sons, Judah is the 4th son. It is through Judah, and we kind of hear the name Judah a lot. Jesus is from the line of Judah. We also know that later on, Israel would break into 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the whole southern kingdom is considered the kingdom of Judah. Judah was one of one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob later on changing his name to Israel, and encompassing the largest portion of the promised land. So he's the 4th son of Jacob, and it is through Judah that the line of King David, and of course then Jesus, we have that ancestry, and therefore the genealogy of Jesus. And like I said, the southern kingdom of Judah is named that. All of this is written in Genesis 37, where it talks about how Jacob had these 12 sons. And then if you remember, and if you ever seen the musical, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, whatever, how these brothers, these 12 brothers, they didn't all quite get along, right? And particularly they ostracized second to the last brother, Joseph, who then gets rejected, thrown into a pit, sold to Egypt. But it is actually through Joseph that the nation of Israel ends up being in Egypt and kind of flourishes. even though Joseph has a huge portion of the story in Genesis, Genesis has 50 chapters, and starting from Genesis 39 to 50, it's all about the story of Joseph. It's through Judah that the line of Jesus comes out of, and even King David. But anyhow, that's all in chapter 37. And then in chapter 38, we have this story about Judah and this woman, Tamar. Okay, and so we're going to read that. Let's see. So Tamar is not Judah's wife. Judah ends up living in Canaan. He ends up marrying a Canaanite, a foreigner, and then has 3 sons. Okay, and the 3 sons are named Onan, and Shilah. Give me 1 second. Why is my... Oh. I realize the PowerPoint didn't update. And then after these 3 sons, the first son, is given in marriage to, or Tamar is given in marriage to I'm going to read this in the Bible. I had actually added this into the PowerPoint, but it didn't update. So I'm just going to read it from the Bible. It happened at the time that Judah went down from his brother and settled near the certain Adulamites, whose name was Harah. There Judah saw a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again, she conceived and bore a son and named him Onan. And yet again, she bore a son and she named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Okay, so that's how the story begins. That Judah ends up having these 3 sons, and living in that region, he found a woman by the name of Tamar, gives him into marriage to his firstborn, but for some reason, the way the scripture just kind of states that was not loyal. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Who knows what that means, right? It's written in the perspective of the biblical writers, whatever they thought was evil in the sight of the Lord. All that means is some tragic event happens to him and he dies. Okay, he dies, leaving Tamar a widow, right? So what happens when a husband dies, and especially if they don't have any children? And this is one of the big challenges of a very patriarchal society, right? Where everything evolves around the man, and the financial and security is all evolved around the man. Are you guys there? For some reason, we all kind of froze for a bit. Okay, so then with in the Jewish tradition, there is something called a levirate law that's in the book of Leviticus that has a certain stipulation. And this, according to this levirate law, it says that if the man of a couple dies before they're able to have children, then it is for the next brother in line to marry the widow so that that widow can bear a child for the deceased lineage. Okay, so the Levirate law basically says it is the responsibility of the second brother, or whoever that's second in line, to marry the widow so that they can have a child, and that child is to be pretty much given in an adoption to the elders who had died. Okay, so that's the Levirate law. Now, it's kind of weird, but that is the law. And I think I have a little diagram of how that works. Here it is. The Levirate law, an ancient custom common in the Middle East, by which a man may be obliged to marry his brother's widow to produce an offspring for the brother that had died, the deceased. And here you have the the diagram of Judah, married Shua, Canaanite, had 3 brothers. Tamar had married Er, and Er dies. Now, when you think of this levirate law, you think, well, that's again, it's kind of thinking of the woman as property, and the woman just kind of gets passed on to the brother, right? But if you really think about it, it's actually for the benefit of the woman. And the reason for that is, again, in ancient times, women didn't own any property, right? Women didn't have, and women usually didn't work, and so they didn't have any source of income or support system other than the male. When a woman is a child, she is cared for by her father's home, right? She's part of the father. The father takes care of all the children. When she gets married, she then, it becomes the responsibility of the husband to care for the woman. If the husband dies and they don't have a child, so usually they would have a children, and the children, and again, a very patriarchal society, they would seek to have a son, so that the son stays within the family, would then, as the parents grow older, would care for the parents, right? So, but if a couple has no child and the husband dies, what happens to the woman? What happens to the woman? And there is no social security system, right? There's no SSI or anything like that in that culture. And so the levirate law was actually created to provide a security system for the woman, that it becomes the responsibility of the next person in line to take her on, and she becomes his responsibility, being married and to take care of her. Interesting thing about the levirate law is that the obligation is of the brothers, the males, to marry her. The woman, on the other hand, actually had the right of refusal. The woman could reject, saying, no, I don't want to be married to the brother. The woman could do that, but if she did that, then of course, she would have no support system, right? But it's an interesting law of how that works, where you actually have, the woman actually has the right of refusal, the choice to say, yes, I'll get married to the brother. But the brother had no choice. It was the law. So what happens? So Er dies, and the next one in line is Onan. And verse 8, let's see, where am I? Okay. Then Judah said to the second, the brother, Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled, well, I never said the Bible was rated G, okay? So just bear with me, some of the language here. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Okay, so without getting into details, what Onan ended up doing was basically he refused to impregnate Tamar. He refused to, it doesn't mean he didn't, have any sexual relations with her. He refused to impregnate her, right? And we can think of every single contraception and whatever that he did to do that. The question is why? Why would he not want to impregnate Tamar, right? According to the levirate law, it was his duty to marry her, and technically, according to the law, his duty is to is to create an offspring, have a child with his new wife, so that that offspring would honor the deceased brother. That's the law. But Onan, it says, because he knew that this offspring, this child, especially if it's a boy, this child would not be his, he refused to have that child. Now, why would he do that? Well, it has to do with the rights of inheritance. In the Jewish tradition, the firstborn has what is known as a double share of inheritance. So usually when a father passes, the property, the estate would be divided up among all the male children. However, the first male, which then becomes the one that kind of passes on the lineage, what they all do, but primarily the first son would always get the double share, right? So the first son would get the double share, and then the rest is children. So if heir didn't die, right? If the older brother heir didn't die, then between heir Onan and Sheila, the estate, Judah's estate, would be divided by 4. Heir would get 2, Onan would get 1, and then Sheila would get 1 share or quarter share, right? But now that heir has died, what happens to the estate? The estate gets divided into 3, right? Because heir is no longer there. And the next person who becomes the first son or the inheritance goes to whom? It actually goes to Onan, because he's the next one in line, unless he bears a child for his brother heir, and then that brother or that child then becomes the inheritance of the double share. Do you see what's happening here? Right? I know it's a math problem. This is the stuff that we put on the SAT and confuse all the kids, right? If Onan had a child for Tamar, or had a child with Tamar, that child then belongs to his older brother heir. And when the father Judah dies, the double portion goes to this child because of the lineage of heir and not his, right? It's not for him. And so because of that, that's the logic. In a sense, it's greed, right? You can pretty much explain all the horrors of this world by that, greed, right? Causes a lot of frustrations and the calamities of the world. Because of that, he refused to. And because he refused to do that, I don't know, God knows, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He basically committed a sin against the family because he was not fulfilling his duty as the second brother. He dies. Okay, so far the story is somewhat comical, but still tragic but comical. So then what happens, right? What does Judah do? What can he do? Well, he had 3 sons, right? The first son dies. He has a second son who, according to the levirate law, marries Tamar. Although he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, he dies. Well, Judah has 1 son left. And according to the levirate law, the third son, Sheila, is supposed to marry. Except for Judah, he doesn't want to. Why? He thinks that something is wrong, right? That his first 2 brothers, that the first 2 sons have died. And he comes to this, he starts thinking that that something is wrong. And here it is. I'm going to read the rest of that portion. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he was put to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, for he feared that he too would die like his brothers." So Tamar went to live with in her father's house. Judah, because his first son dies, his second son dies, he thinks that there's something wrong with Tamar. He doesn't think that it's his own sons that are doing something wrong. He blames it on Tamar. Typical, right? Yeah, typical man. So he blames it on Tamar and says, Tamar, there must be something wrong with Tamar that is causing his sons to die. He only has 3 sons. What happens if his third son dies? He's out of his lineage, right? It's all about keeping their their lineage going, right? That's what they're thinking. And Judah fears that if he gives Tamar in marriage to his last child, Shelah, then he's going to die as well. And so he doesn't. So he instead, says, you know what? My third son, he's a bit too young. He's not quite of age yet to be married. So until the time that he's ready to be married, go to your father's house and live in your father's house until that time. Well, what do you think about that? Do you think Judah had all the intentions of saying, oh, you know what, he's only 17 and a half now, he's not quite an adult yet, wait 6 months? Do you think that's what Judah was thinking?
Nope.
Nope. Right. And the fact that Tamar gets sent to her father's home, that is also not right. That's an insult. Tamar is no longer, when and again, in that society, in the culture, once a woman leaves the father's home and is married to the husband's family, that's the new family that she belongs to. For her to go back to her father's house, and especially if if her father had other sons and other children, she is intruding, right? She's actually put in a very awkward spot. She's no longer, yes, she's still a daughter of her father, but she actually has no rights of any protection in her father's house. So for Judah to even suggest that is very offensive. Basically, he is sending Tamar out without any protection. And it doesn't say what happens, or it doesn't say how long Tamar does stay in her father's house. But this is where the juicy part of the story, if not the story was not juicy enough, begins, right? And it's from verse 20, from 12 to 26. So bear with me as I read this. And again, I must apologize. I actually had all the slideshows so you guys could read along with me. But verse 12. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to, actually before that, oh yeah. Okay, so Tamar went to live with her father's house. We don't know how long it's been afterwards. Verse 12 starts off with, in course of time. It just makes it sound like a lot of time went by, right? And nothing has happened. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. But while Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adulite. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she put off her mourning, her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down on the entrance of Onan, which is on the road of Timnah. She saw that Shelah had grown up, yet she has not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" And he answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock and uh, a sheep, a goat from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet ring and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in with her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. While Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adulite, to recover the pledge from the women, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is that temple prostitute who was on that road to Onan?" But they said, "No prostitute has been there." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been there." Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of the whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these things who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, those whose these are, the signet ring, the cord, and the staff." When Judah recognized them, he said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Sheila." And he did not lie with her again. All right. If anyone says that the Bible is not interesting, they haven't read the Bible, because they are, and you can write soap operas and you can write movies out of this stuff. What happens? Okay, so you hear this story, this dynamic, and what are your reactions? What do you think? Do you get what's happening here?
Yes, I think she took revenge, realizing that he wasn't ever going to give her to his youngest son, and she tricked him. And so I think now he has to bear the responsibility.
Right, right. What was that, Nancy?
I said exactly.
Exactly. Right. So how do you feel about the story? Was it right? Was it wrong? What part of the story feels uncomfortable?
All of it.
All of it feels uncomfortable. Well, all of us.
But isn't she giving him an heir?
Bill, you know the story. Exactly right. Well, we'll get to that part. But yeah, because well, first of all, yeah, who's right, who's wrong? Definitely, what Judah said was she's more in the right than him. There was a law. Judah tried to back out from the law. He didn't say that he wasn't going to fulfill the levirate law by giving his son to Tamar, or vice versa, give Tamar to her son, his son, Sheila, but he didn't want to, right? He was trying to delay it. How long would he have delayed it? Who knows? Maybe after she has passed her age of bearing child, who knows, right? But definitely he was it states that the third son was already of age, was an adult, was already of age to be married, and yet she was not given to him in marriage yet. Kind of puts everyone, all the parties involved in a tough situation. Definitely for Tamar, because if she doesn't have a husband or a child, her social security is in jeopardy, right? You have to kind of ask yourself, was Judah thinking through this whole thing, because everyone knows the law, the family would know the law, community would know the law. And in a sense, if he did not give Tamar in marriage to his third son, Sheila, he would not be able to, or, you know, it's, everyone would know that he's not following through. Plus, you know, Sheila, unless, yes, you know, he could have offered up other wives for Sheila, but the first law would have been to fulfill the Levirate law first. So in a way, by holding on to Sheila not being married, he's also not allowing for his lineage to continue beyond Sheila, right? So there is a complication here.
And I think it shows that when you act out of fear, because he feared that his third son would die like his first two, you sometimes make wrong decisions.
Wrong decisions, bad decisions, exactly right. So Tamar's options, what were they? One, to remain childless, right? Living with her father, which again, she would be considered a foreigner or an outsider of her father's home, because she has already been given in marriage to Judah's family. And what happens if, when her father dies, she still has nothing, and there is no inheritance that would ever go to her. So she actually, it's nothing. There's no future there, right? She could try to marry someone else, but that's not exactly, Bill's like, no way. Because once you are married, the likelihood of that is very, you know, in that, especially in that culture, that doesn't happen, right? And that's why even through the New Testament, you have this very clear sense of obligation within the Christian community to and the Jewish community to care for the widows, because widows, those who have been married, have no other support system. It is unless the community helps out, they actually have no support system. They can't just go around marrying someone else. The third option is to figure out a way to bear a child through Judah's family. She just had to figure out how, right? She just had to find a way. And this is what she does. She pretends to be a prostitute. The question here in all this is actually a question of honor. For Judah, you know, Judah's response, well, so after Judah gets word, so after this whole thing happens, and word gets to Judah that Tamar is pregnant, you have to kind of think, you know, what's going on in Judah's mind? In a way, he had already sort of rejected her, right? In a way, by sending her to her father's home, maybe he thought that, okay, you know, I don't have to worry about her anymore, right? But as soon as word gets to him that, hey, Tamar is pregnant, he reacts. He reacts, or almost overreacts. Why? Because it's a sense of honor that his daughter-in-law became pregnant by someone outside of the family, right? And so his response to Tamar's pregnancy is that she sinned against the family. Now, of course, it doesn't dawn on him that his first two sons had sinned against the family, or what? Well, I don't know what happened with the first son, but definitely the second son, right, had sinned against family. He doesn't think about that. He thinks about his daughter-in-law sinning against the family, and he's also thinking about, you know, the righteousness that he needs to be seen in the public, in the community, as being and his family to being a righteous family. So this is what gets to him. And of course, what is his response? Bring her out and let her be burned, right? That's his response. When he is shown by Tamar, these are the possessions of the person who that the child belongs to, his response is, "Oh my." You know, I mean, seriously, this is the stuff that makes great movies, right? Or sort of. It's extreme. It's drama here, but the response here of Tamar is an act of confession. It's a moment of repentance for him, and when he says, you know, what she's done is more right than what he's done. He's saying, it's not saying that, you know, her going around and deceiving and disguising and all of that. It's not something that we promote as being, you know, this is what you should do. However, what he's saying is what he was doing was worse, right? And what was he doing that was worse? He was protecting his family, right? Or was he?
He wasn't fulfilling the law.
Okay, wasn't fulfilling the law. What was that, Emily?
That's not me.
Oh, okay.
I was agreeing. I was agreeing with Chris that we're on the same wavelength here. You know,
Oh.
he wasn't following the law.
He's not following the law, right? But it's not just about the law, right? The laws are there to kind of give us guidelines, but ultimately it's about what's right, right? It's about righteousness. It's about what's right. I mean, even if the levirate law is there to protect the woman, but it's also about what's right in caring for who are our family members, right? And in a sense, what Judah was doing was not only not fulfilling the law, but saying, my own well-being is better or is more important than someone else, right? There's a term here called zedekah mimeni. Where's my mouse? Okay, and basically what that means is she is more in the right than I. And that's what he says. That's his confession. And again, as I was saying, it's actually translated. She, or Tamar, is completely innocent of anything that she does. That even though it may not be right, it's not something that you would normally do, but she is completely innocent of any wrongdoing, and therefore, yes, he is confessing that the child is mine, and he confesses to that.
Albert, this sort of honor killing still goes on in many places in the Middle East today, where if the family is seen to be shamed, that daughter will be killed.
Yes.
So this has a very long tradition behind it. And it still goes on in areas of the Middle East today, Afghanistan particularly. Right. And we sometimes will hear stories about that. So yeah, it's putting family honor above the value of another human being. Right, exactly. And that's where this sort of kind of gets at is, there's these things called the laws, right? And they're there to kind of provide some guidelines. But it's more than that. It's not just about the law. It's about the person, right? And you're right. What Tamar has done, well, first of all, what Judah was fearing was about the life of his children, right? Yes, there's this concern about the inheritance that is going on, but again, he's also concerned about his image, being seen righteous in the community. But then ultimately, he then becomes concerned about the life of his own children, right? almost to the point where he's willing to say, well, someone else, even his own daughter-in-law is not as important, and therefore willing to kind of reject her and just kind of throw her out to fend for herself. And this law is, yes, it's created to kind of provide that protection, but again, the laws only go so far. And in many ways, what Judah was looking for is a loophole to that law to not give his third son to Tamar. And in this sense, what it shows is that Tamar had to, bless her heart, find a creative way out of this. She's put in a very tough situation. She has to find a creative way out of this. And what she did may not be considered, fully kosher, fully, honorable. And yet, her innocence is beyond the stuff that she does. So in other words, and what Judah is saying is, it doesn't matter what she did. It doesn't matter that she deceived me and tricked me. And my goodness, I just have a child with my daughter-in-law, right? Beyond that, he's saying she is innocent of all that. Right? And so you're right. It is about, a life of Tamar, whatever it takes to live. So what do we learn from Tamar's story?
Moral questions are fairly complicated, not so simple.
You're exactly right. Mindful of our moral reactions, right? I mean, when you first hear the story that Tamar is like, oh my gosh, well, first of all, the story itself, I would definitely rate it as being rated, I don't know, more than PG-13, for Bible story. It gets pretty detailed. And you look at the dynamics of what's going on here, and it's so easy to make those quick moral judgments. A moral judgment upon Tamar, moral judgment even upon Judah, a moral judgment upon Onan. Everyone had their reasoning or their fear factors of why fear or greed of why they did what they did. However, especially for Tamar, the fact that what she did, you have to be mindful of our knee-jerk reaction, and for Judah to immediately say, just let her be burned, without fully realizing the bigger picture. What else do we learn from this story?
It brings up the thing, follow the money.
What was that? Follow the money?
Yeah.
We definitely want to, no, there you go. There's a couple of things, right, that we learn from this. Definitely, be mindful of moral judgments, refrain from judgment. No person, life, or family lineage is perfect. It's one of the things that I really pick up on, especially when you read about the fact that Tamar is part of Jesus's lineage. Jesus is his lineage. Every person, every family story in the Bible and throughout the Old Testament, it is some crazy drama in every single story. And so, as we think about what it means to be a people of faith or a community, a church, it's not about perfection. Life is not about perfection. And in this story, we definitely see the struggles that Judah had to go through, the struggle that Tamar had to go through. And it is through, stories like this that the line of King David and the line of Jesus comes out of.
So does it follow that if there's no child, there's no David and there's no Jesus?
Well,
because that was the line.
It is. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what Tamar did gave us King David and gave us Jesus. That's right. So that's right. Any other thoughts? Well, next week we're going to be continuing on, and we'll go to the second person, the second female in Jesus's line lineage, and we'll be studying Ruth. And again, Ruth has her own book, and in that story itself, we see some dynamics, challenges, what it means to be a woman living in the culture and the society at that time, and the challenges. And her and her mother-in-law Naomi's quick thinking to survive, right? So let me lead us in prayer as we close out today's session. Oh, gracious God, we truly give you thanks for this time together, and for as we look into the story of Tamar, oh God. We pray that as we look at these stories, that we glean upon what it means to be a people of faith, and look upon our actions and our reactions to life, to these stories, and to the people around us. Lord, help us to have hearts of compassion, and to have hearts of open-minded, or to have open-mindedness, that we see beyond situations, to see the needs of persons, people. Be with us as we continue in our studies and our growth and in life. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Albert.
Blessings. Thank you for joining me.
Mhm.